HOA Karen spilled boiling water on my disabled daughter. Yes, you heard that right. The president of our neighborhood's homeowners association deliberately poured scalding water onto my child while glaring at me with cold satisfaction, as though she believed she could do such a thing with impunity. I never imagined I would have to rescue my daughter from a nightmare in what should have been a peaceful suburban community. The moment it happened, the sound of my little girl's scream tore through the warm summer air. I felt something primal surge inside me, more powerful than any emotion I'd experienced before. It wasn't just anger. It was raw, protective rage, mixed with the disbelief that a grown woman would stoop so low as to harm a disabled child. I'm Dr. Andrew Mitchell. I'm a trauma surgeon who recently moved here for a new job opportunity, hoping this place might offer a fresh start after a series of personal tragedies. We hadn't even unpacked all our boxes when the trouble with the HOA began. But never, in my worst nightmares, did I think it would spiral into a horrifying assault. An assault that would lead me to uncover just how vicious and perhaps corrupt this homeowners association truly could be. They call it Millstone Court, a postcard-perfect cul-de-sac flanked by pristine lawns, symmetrical hedges, and elaborate flower gardens that whisper of enviable prosperity. Behind every polished door resides a carefully curated family, a certain facade of success that the HOA aims to maintain at all costs. If someone's paint is peeling or their fence is an inch too high, the HOA steps in with warnings, fines, or whatever else they conjure up. But from the very moment my daughter and I arrived, we sensed something was off. I'm a single father, which already drew a few raised eyebrows. Some neighbors seemed to wonder why a man would handle both the rigors of a demanding medical career and the role of primary caregiver to a disabled child. Their stares told me they had questions they might never dare to voice aloud. But more than that, I noticed a particularly hard gaze from the woman who introduced herself as Karen Holt, the HOA president, and she made a point of appearing in my driveway the day we moved in. "We keep high standards here, doctor," she said, eyes gliding over my boxes stacked on the lawn. "Hope you'll abide by all the rules." There was no warmth in her tone, only an implied threat that if I dared to disrupt her perfect community, she'd be watching me closely. That first encounter set a chilling precedent, but I tried to shrug it off. I had too many tasks on my plate. Finding a suitable care regimen for my daughter, Danielle, adjusting to my new hospital environment, and juggling the usual demands of daily life. Danielle had been paralyzed from the waist down after a drunk driver hit us 3 years prior. The collision took my wife's life and forever changed ours. Danielle was only 10 at the time. Now she's 13, with a bright smile and an even brighter heart, despite all she's endured. She uses a wheelchair, and although that shouldn't matter to decent human beings, it apparently mattered to Karen Holt. Little by little, the HOA started scrutinizing every tiny detail of my property. "Your wheelchair ramp wasn't pre-approved," said one letter. "Your trash bin placement violates our guidelines," said another. Each complaint came signed by Karen. It felt like she was trying to bait me, push me into reacting so she could justify heavier penalties. But I'm not the kind of man who picks fights over trifles, especially while my daughter is adjusting to a new environment. Instead, I attempted to handle things amicably, submitting forms, attaching pictures, adhering to the labyrinth of HOA procedures. That was the game, I supposed. I had no clue how deeply twisted it would become. One afternoon, I overheard Karen on the sidewalk telling a neighbor that my daughter's wheelchair ramp was an eyesore. Another day, she loudly commented that children with disabilities often bring down property values because of added modifications that normal families don't want to see. My blood boiled. I confronted her politely, though my voice wavered with emotion. "Mrs. Holt," I said, "I'm sorry if the ramp offends you, but it's necessary for my daughter's mobility." She looked at me with a condescending half-smile and replied, "If it's truly necessary, you should have moved somewhere more appropriate. We have guidelines to keep up appearances, doctor." The smugness in her eyes made me realize she was testing how far she could push me. maybe even deriving pleasure from my discomfort. I had saved countless lives on the operating table. I had seen the worst injuries imaginable, yet I felt no greater pain than standing helplessly in front of this woman while she insulted my daughter's existence. But I forced myself to remain calm, fighting her with reason, hoping that somewhere under her hardened exterior a shred of empathy might dwell. Little did I know, empathy was nowhere in her vocabulary. A few weeks passed. I tried to avoid contact as best I could, focusing on making our house a home for Danielle. She loved to watch the sunset from the front porch. It gave her a sense of peace. Meanwhile, I discovered new complexities about the neighborhood. People constantly complained about the HOA's heavy-handed approach, but few dared to challenge Karen openly. Rumors circulated about her close ties to a local council member, how she'd leveraged that influence to push through zoning changes that benefited developers, and how she twisted the association's rules to keep certain residents in check. It sounded like a small-scale power trip that had grown too big. Some even whispered about bribes changing hands behind closed doors. But I'm not one to put stock in rumors unless there's evidence. Instead, I quietly observed. My medical training had taught me to gather data before diagnosing a problem. Danielle, resilient as ever, had started making friends with two neighborhood kids, Jenny and Lucas, who lived down the street. They weren't scared off by her wheelchair, and sometimes they'd all play board games or gather in front of the local pond to watch ducks glide by. One Saturday morning, I decided to let them hang out at the community playground while I stayed at home to catch up on patient reports. I could see part of the playground from my upstairs window, and it was only a few houses away. If anything happened, I could rush over in minutes. The day was bright. The sky held no clouds. It seemed an idyllic moment. Danielle flashed me a grin before rolling away down the sidewalk. Lucas and Jenny flanked her, chattering excitedly about whatever game they planned to play. I swear, seeing her happy like that reminded me of better times, of days before the accident when she could run on her own 2 feet. I told myself this was part of her healing, social interaction, laughter, a chance to feel included among her peers. My mind settled into a comfortable lull, and I returned to my paperwork, never imagining the next hour would turn into a living nightmare. I first noticed an odd commotion, loud voices from the direction of the playground, even though I couldn't see clearly who was shouting. I stood up, stepped closer to the window, and caught sight of Karen's distinctive blonde hair near the swing set. She was gesturing angrily toward my daughter and her friends. My heart pounded. I fumbled to open the window, hoping to hear what was being said. I caught fragments. "This is not your personal therapy center," Karen snapped, her voice echoing across the quiet street. "You kids are causing a ruckus," Danielle responded in a shaky tone I could barely make out. "We're just playing. We're not bothering anyone." Then Karen stepped closer, too close. My anxiety spiked. I sprinted downstairs and out the front door without a second thought. By the time I reached the sidewalk, the horror had already happened. Karen held a steaming kettle in her right hand. My daughter's shirt was drenched. Scalding water clung to her skin as she screamed in agony. Jenny and Lucas stood by, frozen with terror. The moment I saw Danielle's face contorted in pain, everything inside me erupted. As a trauma surgeon, I've encountered third-degree burns. I know how swiftly boiling water can fuse cloth to flesh. My immediate instinct was to treat the burn, but I also had a father's rage blazing in me. Karen unbelievably looked almost triumphant, like she had proven some twisted point. She said something like, "Maybe now you'll learn to respect private property," her voice dripping with malice. I was too stunned to respond for a split second. Then my training kicked in. I rushed to Danielle, carefully assessing the damage. I shouted for someone to call an ambulance. A neighbor across the street, Michael Ross, already had his phone out filming. He later told me he'd been recording the argument from the start, sensing that Karen might do something drastic. The kettle's water had struck Danielle's right arm and torso. She quivered, her hands gripping the edges of her wheelchair, tears streaking down her cheeks. I gently peeled back the parts of her shirt not stuck to the skin. The rest I had to leave until we could get sterile scissors and professional help. "Dad, it hurts," she cried, her voice trembling so violently it sent spikes of terror through me. "I know, baby, hang on," I whispered, forcing myself to remain composed. "We're going to get you help right now." A crowd was gathering, neighbors who had heard the shriek or seen the commotion. Karen, still holding the kettle, muttered something about teaching a lesson and disrupting the peace. My teeth clenched. Every fiber of my being wanted to tear into her, but I couldn't abandon my daughter to do it. Instead, I focused on Danielle, checking her burn severity, trying to keep her talking, stable and conscious. Jenny and Lucas hovered close by, tears in their eyes, as though they couldn't comprehend the cruelty that had just unfolded. Karen tried to march away, but Michael Ross blocked her path, phone still recording. "Don't you go anywhere," he growled. "I've got this all on video, and the cops are on their way. You assaulted a child." Karen's eyes widened in alarm, then narrowed, as though deciding whether she could bluff her way out of this. "It was an accident," she snapped, flipping her hair over her shoulder. "These kids refused to leave. I tripped, the water spilled. This is all their fault for causing trouble." But the lie was transparent. Everyone who'd seen the confrontation knew she'd done it with intent. Perhaps a part of her believed she was merely enacting the HOA's standards, a twisted notion of discipline. Unfortunately for her, I was both a father and a trauma specialist who understood precisely the nature of burn injuries. This was no harmless accident. Within minutes, sirens blared. I knelt by Danielle, my arm wrapped around her uninjured side. I could sense the heat radiating off her burns. When the paramedics arrived, I identified myself as Dr. Andrew Mitchell, a trauma surgeon, and swiftly explained the extent of the injury as best I could. They carefully transferred Danielle onto a stretcher. Her whimpers cut through me like knives. Karen stood to the side, flanked by 2 police officers who bombarded her with questions. One officer approached me, eyes scanning the scene. "We got a call about an assault. Can you tell me what happened?" I took a moment to steady my voice, then recounted the entire horrifying sequence. Meanwhile, Michael Ross offered his phone footage. It clearly contradicted Karen's "I tripped" excuse. The officer scribbled notes, glancing at Karen with disbelief. "You threw boiling water on a child over a playground dispute?" "Shh," he asked, his voice thick with incredulity. Karen stammered. "The noise was out of control. There are rules. They weren't following them." I turned away, knowing any response I gave would be laced with anger. My priority was Danielle's immediate care. The ambulance doors closed on me and my daughter. The interior was a whirlwind of medical supplies and professionals doing their best to stabilize her. One paramedic inserted an IV line for pain management. Another carefully examined the burn areas, ensuring no secondary complications threatened her life. Danielle clutched my hand, tears streaming down her face. "Dad, why would she do that?" she asked, voice cracking. I wasn't hurting anyone. My eyes pricked with my own tears, but I forced them back, determined to remain strong. "Some people see differences as threats," I murmured, brushing a strand of hair off her damp forehead. "But we won't let her get away with this, I promise." That vow became the anchor that steadied me as the ambulance sped toward the local hospital. Once there, I guided the burn unit team through the specifics, assisting in her treatment to the extent protocol allowed. I recognized a few medical staff from my workplace. They glanced at me with compassion and shock, offering every available resource to ensure Danielle's swift and thorough recovery. As Danielle was whisked into a specialized treatment room, I momentarily stepped away to speak with the attending physician, Dr. Paloma Ruiz, a colleague who specialized in pediatric burns. She assured me that while the scalding water had caused second-degree burns over a significant area, they were optimistic about her eventual recovery, provided we managed pain and prevented infection. Skin grafts might be needed if certain sections progressed to deeper burns, but for now, they'd aimed for careful debridement and aggressive wound care. My relief was tempered by the knowledge that Danielle faced weeks, perhaps months, of painful dressing changes, therapy, and psychological trauma, All because a woman who deemed herself the queen of our HOA decided my daughter didn't belong at a public playground. Karen's audacity didn't end with the assault. Within hours, my phone lit up with messages from neighbors, some outraged, others frightened. One text read, "So sorry, Doc. That woman's insane. We're behind you." Another said, "We've dealt with her for years." Threatens, fines, intimidation. Please help us stop her. Each new message peeled back the layers of fear that had built up in the community, revealing the magnitude of Karen's tyranny. It wasn't just about wheelchair ramps or playgrounds. She was rumored to manipulate the HOA bylaws to her personal advantage, rewriting guidelines that forced residents to pay for expensive landscaping from her cousin's company, or imposing fines that seemed to vanish into thin air. Some neighbors suspected she laundered the extra funds. Others believed she had strong political connections that shielded her from accountability. My anger grew as I realized Danielle and I had fallen victim to a wide network of corruption that had festered in a place people were supposed to call home. But I didn't want vengeance for vengeance's sake. I wanted justice, real justice that would protect my daughter, my neighbors, and any future resident from Karen's abuses. The police, from what I could tell, took the assault seriously. They reviewed Michael Ross's video, interviewed witnesses, and promptly charged Karen with aggravated assault. Yet I sensed a deeper rot in the system, something that might allow her to wriggle free if not carefully monitored. Maybe it was just cynicism from my experiences dealing with bureaucratic hospital management, or stories I'd heard about local officials who looked the other way when money talked. Regardless, I knew I had to approach this methodically. For the first few days after the incident, my focus remained on Danielle. I stayed at her hospital bedside, helping her cope with the pain. She was brave, though tears often glistened in her eyes when doctors arrived to check her burns or change bandages. At 13, she'd already endured a car crash that claimed her mother's life and left her unable to walk. Now, this. Yet somehow, she still found the strength to smile when I joked about the silly hospital cafeteria food or the bright pink bandages they used on her arms. Each day, I updated her on what was happening outside. "Karen's been arrested," I told her softly, "and we have Michael's video. She won't be able to say it was just an accident." Danielle's relief was palpable. She nodded, wincing at a sudden jolt of pain. "She hates me for no reason, Dad," she whispered. "Why do people do that?" I sighed, trying to phrase a response that might make sense of the senseless. Sometimes hate is just ignorance or fear, and sometimes it's about power. They like controlling others, and when someone is different, it threatens their little bubble. When Danielle was stable enough to be released from the hospital, we returned home late in the evening. Imagine our surprise when we pulled into the driveway and found a group of neighbors holding a small vigil, complete with handmade signs that read, "Get well soon and stop the HOA abuse." They clapped quietly, not wanting to overwhelm her, but their presence was heartwarming. A testament that not everyone in Millstone Court harbored Karen's cruelty. Sarah Johnson, an elderly woman from 2 houses down, approached us and offered a covered dish. "I made a casserole for you," she said. Tears shimmered in her eyes. "I'm so sorry for what happened. Karen's done terrible things to many of us, but this was beyond anything. If you need help with anything, let us know." I thanked her and brought Danielle inside. Though physically exhausted, she was moved by the support. That evening, once Danielle had settled into bed, I looked over the messages from neighbors more thoroughly. Several described experiences of intimidation. Karen threatened to have my pool filled in because it was too noisy when my nephews visited. Or she said she'd report me to child services for letting my kids play in the front yard without her permission. A single pattern emerged. She used the HOA's rules as a personal weapon, collecting fines or scaring people until they backed down. Then there were allegations about her forging signatures to approve lavish landscaping projects that the HOA fees somehow had to cover. Others believe she sold permits under the table to local businesses wanting to circumvent zoning restrictions. This wasn't just petty bullying, it smelled of fraud and corruption. The more I read, the more I understood that Karen had built a small empire of fear, enforced by her seat on the HOA and her rumored ties to local officials. I considered hiring a private investigator, but before I could act, a knock on my door jolted me from my thoughts. It was Michael Ross, the man who had recorded the assault, and with him a younger woman named Carla, who introduced herself as a law student interning at a nearby firm. She had grown up in the area and knew of Karen's many misdeeds. "We want to help," Michael said simply. Carla nodded, her dark hair pulled into a neat ponytail. "We've heard from multiple residents. You've got a solid case for a civil lawsuit, maybe even a criminal conspiracy angle if we dig deeper. But first, we need a thorough record of everything." I motioned them inside. We sat in the living room, the hush broken only by the occasional beep of the medical monitor I'd set up for Danielle. The sense of purpose in the air was palpable, as though we all realized that this was the time to stand up and not cower anymore. Carla spread out a folder filled with documents. "I got these from a colleague who handles property disputes. Check out these zoning permits." She pointed to a series of signatures that granted a private contractor the right to demolish an old wetlands area near our development. And apparently the environment there was quite delicate, and a few years back they were discussing building a small industrial complex, but the project was halted because of environmental concerns. Then it mysteriously got approved. That's about the time Karen joined the HOA board. Rumor has it she brokered a deal that funneled money to local council members for a green light. My eyes scanned the papers, noticing that one of the signatures belonged to a local official I recognized from the news, a name that had surfaced in corruption allegations before. "So, there might be more than just petty harassment," I said. "We could be looking at a broader web of kickbacks and environmental damage." Carla nodded, a serious glint in her gaze. "If we can tie the assault on your daughter to her ongoing pattern of abusing power, it might force an official investigation. Public pressure could be the key." While I was horrified by the scope of wrongdoing, a small part of me felt relief that maybe, just maybe, this horrifying incident could drive positive change. Karen's cruelty might finally bring her entire operation down. Yet I had to be careful. The primary focus was Danielle's well-being. I promised Carla and Michael that I'd gather whatever documentation I could find. They in turn said they'd talk to more neighbors, compile testimonies, and see how best to present this to the authority. Meanwhile, Karen posted bail. I found out the next day when a police officer called to update me that she'd been released with an order not to come near me or my daughter. The thought of her prowling around, perhaps seeking to intimidate witnesses or hide evidence, made my stomach churn. But I held fast, determined to see this through. Over the next couple of weeks, Danielle's burns started healing. She still needed daily dressing changes, which were excruciating. I used every ounce of my medical knowledge to ensure she was cared for properly. At the same time, I found myself inundated by neighbors quietly coming forward, sharing experiences of harassment and shady dealings. One older gentleman, Mr. Hamilton, revealed that Karen had coerced him into donating a portion of his backyard to create a community garden that the produce was funneled to a gourmet market she owned shares in. Another mother, Linda, tearfully recounted how Karen threatened to label her as an unfit parent if her children kept skating on the sidewalk. The stories piled up into a tapestry of abuse that extended far beyond the water incident. Carla compiled everything into an ever-expanding digital folder. She uncovered property records that suggested Karen had orchestrated a land grab, snapping up undervalued houses whose owners felt forced to sell under constant HOA fines. Each detail built our case, but it also painted a bleak picture of what unchecked power can do in a seemingly normal suburban community. Despite these revelations, or perhaps because of them, I noticed certain individuals distancing themselves. A few neighbors who initially seemed eager to help now avoided eye contact when I walked by. A friend of Karen's, rumored to be on the board of a local bank, might have threatened that anyone who opposed Karen would find it harder to secure mortgages or loans. The intimidation tactics were relentless, but they only fueled my resolve. In the midst of it all, my hospital workload ramped up. Life in the trauma department never truly slows. Gunshot wounds, car accidents, freak mishaps, they all poured in daily. Balancing my professional duties with the stress of Danielle's recovery and the ongoing investigation took its toll. I struggled to sleep. I caught myself snapping at colleagues or losing focus during routine procedures. Guilt gnawed at me. A father should be able to provide a safe environment for his child, yet mine had been assaulted at a playground. I wondered if I should have moved to a different neighborhood. But then I saw how Danielle, despite her bandaged arm, was forging ahead with her physical therapy, refusing to lose her smile. And I reminded myself that running away would only empower people like Karen to keep terrorizing others. The next major development arrived with a phone call from Carla. She was breathless with excitement. "Andrew, you won't believe what just fell into our laps. Another HOA board member, her name's Patricia Maxwell, reached out. She says she has records of the HOA's finances that show a lot of irregularities, including the money used to influence that wetlands demolition. She's too scared to come forward publicly, but she's willing to give us copies of everything." I gripped the phone tighter. "When can we get them?" "Tonight," Carla replied. "She wants to meet in person, away from prying eyes." My heart pounded with anticipation. This could be the evidence that sets a real investigation in motion. Maybe it would be enough to ensure Karen faced not only assault charges, but also full legal scrutiny for her larger misdeeds. That evening, after ensuring Danielle was resting comfortably, I drove to the secluded parking lot of a church on the edge of town, Patricia's chosen meeting spot. Moonlight glimmered on the pavement. Carla was already there, leaning against her small sedan. Within minutes, another car pulled up. Out stepped Patricia, tall, middle-aged, looking frazzled yet determined. She had a folder tucked under one arm. "I can't stay long," she said in a hushed voice. "Karen's people keep tabs on me. They've tried to dig up dirt on my family." She opened the folder, revealing printouts and spreadsheets, emails with suspicious attachments, and notes that pointed to hush money paid to various individuals, officials, contractors, even a building inspector. I scanned a few pages, my anger rising with each discovered wrongdoing. Patricia sighed. "I joined the HOA board thinking I could improve the neighborhood. Then Karen gradually took over. She's cunning, knows how to hold secrets over people's heads. Once she implied she had dirt on me that could ruin my marriage if I didn't comply. But the moment she hurt your daughter, that was my line in the sand." I thanked her, promising we'd protect her anonymity as much as possible. Driving home with the folder felt surreal, like I'd crossed into a clandestine world of whispered deals and betrayal. This was no longer just about Danielle's assault. It was about exposing a bigger chain of corruption embedded in what should be a simple civic association. Late that night, I updated Michael Ross. He was shocked yet vindicated. "I always knew Karen's operation was rotten, but this is bigger than I expected," he said quietly. We planned our next steps carefully. We'd pass everything to Carla's supervising attorney, who would then coordinate with law enforcement. The local police station might be compromised if Karen truly had connections, so we contemplated approaching the state bureau that handles financial crimes. It was a calculated risk, but we believed the evidence was strong enough to demand a thorough investigation. A few days later, as Danielle was finally able to return to her normal routines, albeit with protective bandages, an unmarked car pulled up in front of our house. Two men stepped out and rang the bell. Identifying themselves as detectives from the State Bureau, they asked to speak with me about the HOA allegations. I ushered them inside, gave them coffee, and handed over Patricia's folder along with Michael's video footage. Over the course of an hour, we talked through what we had uncovered. From fraudulent property sales to hush money payments, the lead detective, a tall man with a stern expression, let out a low whistle. You're telling me that the person who assaulted your daughter is likely part of a bigger racket involving environmental damage and bribery? That's quite the array of charges if it all checks out. He took notes, asked for specific details, and assured me they'd proceed carefully. For the first time since the boiling water incident, I felt a glimmer of hope that justice might not only punish Karen for harming Danielle, but also address the underlying corruption that had plagued our neighborhood for years. Word spread quietly that investigators were sniffing around. Some board members resigned overnight, one left town abruptly. Karen, on the other hand, doubled down, maintaining her innocence at every turn, blaming slander and fabricated documents. She made public statements declaring she was the victim of a witch hunt orchestrated by disgruntled residents. But the more she protested, the more suspicious she appeared. Her assault case was moving forward, albeit slowly. She pleaded not guilty, citing self-defense, a claim utterly discredited by the footage. Yet she had money for top-tier legal representation, courtesy of her alleged corrupt dealings. The entire spectacle brought tension to our once quiet street. Some neighbors whispered that I should watch my back. "She'll come after you," they warned. "Be careful." But how could I be afraid of her when she'd already done the worst thing imaginable, hurting my child? I was more determined than ever to see her face the consequences. Meanwhile, Danielle continued her recovery, experiencing daily pains but also noticing gradual improvements. She resumed online schooling until she could return to a normal classroom schedule. Her friends visited often, offering card games or jokes to lighten her mood. Sometimes she'd roll herself out onto the porch and just watch the sunlight dance across our street. The memory of Karen's kettle loomed large, yet Danielle was forging ahead with a courage that humbled me. She'd ask occasionally, "Dad, is that woman still free?" And I'd have to explain that yes, for now, but justice takes time. "We have to trust the process," I'd say, though part of me wanted immediate retribution. Weeks stretched into months. Investigators dug deeper, unearthing a paper trail that linked Karen to at least 3 local officials and 1 developer with a history of environmental violations. A judge unsealed documents showing questionable HOA fee allocations, large sums that vanished into accounts tied to Karen's confidants. Word came down that a grand jury might convene to consider a range of charges. Racketeering, money laundering, bribery. It was bigger than any of us dared hope. During this time, Karen's arrogance began to crumble. She no longer strolled around the neighborhood with her usual pomp. Instead, she tried to rally the few supporters she had left. Flyers appeared on doorsteps, accusing me and other residents of conspiring to destroy the HOA from within. But these desperate tactics only solidified the community's resolve. More neighbors stepped forward with testimonies and evidence of harassment. The momentum was unstoppable. On a brisk morning, I learned that Karen's court date for the assault charge had been scheduled. I prepared for the legal proceedings, collecting every medical record, every photograph of Danielle's burns, every statement from witnesses. I also handed over the final portion of the official detective's report, which described the incident in detail, linking it to Karen's broader pattern of intimidation. In the days leading up to the trial, I could see Danielle was nervous, worried she might have to relive the trauma. But I reassured her that this was about telling the truth, about preventing Karen from hurting anyone else. The night before we testified, I found Danielle quietly in her room, looking at pictures of herself from before the accident, before the wheelchair. I knelt beside her. "We've been through so much," I said softly. "I wish I could shield you from all of this, but you deserve justice, and so does every other person she's tormented." Danielle nodded, her eyes glistening with tears. "I know, Dad." The courtroom was crowded. Media had caught wind of the assault case tied to rumored HOA corruption, so a few local reporters sat in the back, notebooks and cameras at the ready. Karen arrived with her attorney, wearing a conservative suit rather than her typical designer clothes. Her eyes darted around, as though searching for escape. When she saw me, she sneered, but I refused to drop my gaze. I had resolved to face her bravely. The prosecution laid out the case with precision. Michael Ross's video left no room for doubt. Karen was seen marching toward Danielle, kettle in hand, shouting about getting rid of troublemakers. Danielle's screams and Karen's cold glare at the camera were all the jury needed to see the deliberate nature of the act. My own testimony as a trauma surgeon underscored the severity of scald injury. This was not a minor spill, I stated calmly. The water had to be near boiling temperature. My daughter's wounds were consistent with water poured from a height, not an accidental tip-over. Karen's defense lawyer tried to paint her as a victim of confusion, claiming the children had been trespassing, that Karen slipped, that it was a momentary lapse, but each point crumbled under cross-examination. Witness after witness confirmed Karen's history of using HOA rules as a weapon, her hostility toward Danielle's disability, and the manipulative stance she often took. The defense had little to counter the incriminating video. Eventually, the prosecutor introduced the emergent allegations of fraud, suggesting Karen's motive was to keep the neighborhood under a tight grip, ensuring she could continue her illicit dealings without resistance. Though this trial was strictly about the assault, the subtext was undeniable. The verdict came swiftly, guilty of aggravated assault. The judge's tone was severe, stating that the cruelty inflicted upon a disabled child warranted a harsher sentence. Karen was remanded into custody, pending the sentencing hearing. Outside the courtroom, I exhaled a breath I'd felt I'd been holding since that awful day. Reporters clamored for statements. I made a brief one, expressing gratitude that the legal system had recognized my daughter's suffering and condemnation for the broader corruption that needed thorough investigation. A few weeks later, an even bigger bombshell dropped. The State Bureau concluded its inquiry, revealing enough evidence to charge Karen and several co-conspirators with racketeering and other white-collar crimes. The local council member she colluded with also faced indictments. The wetlands demolition deal, the bribes, the misuse of HOA funds, it all came crashing down like a house of cards. Millstone Court found itself in the spotlight as an example of how a homeowners association could morph into a corrupt power structure if left unchecked. The day Karen was led away in handcuffs for the second time, awaiting trial on a slew of felony charges, many neighbors stood on their porches, silently watching. Some recorded the moment, others wept in relief. It was a collective exhale, a final unmasking of the tyranny they had lived under for too long. Though the legal battle was far from over, our small corner of suburbia felt cleansed. A new interim HOA board formed, pledging transparency, reduced fees, and a reevaluation of all the rules Karen had manipulated. They apologized to Danielle and me, personally visiting our home to assure us that no child would ever again be excluded or endangered on their watch. They even began building a wheelchair-accessible play area, something that could have helped Danielle years ago. When the board members asked for my input, I was surprised by the wave of emotions: gratitude, anger at what had happened, and hope for a better future all at once. Danielle, upon hearing the news, asked if they could include extra features like sensory-friendly equipment for kids with various disabilities. The new HOA leadership seemed eager to follow her suggestions. Perhaps it was their way of making amends. Eventually, Karen was sentenced for assault, receiving prison time and a substantial fine. The judge in the corruption case also handed down a stiff penalty. Her once influential name became synonymous with greed and cruelty. As for those who had aided her, many struck plea deals, turning over further evidence that spelled doom for the corrupt officials who had partnered with her. Millstone Court, over the next year, underwent a transformation. The air felt lighter. Properties that once had for sale signs out front were bought by families who hoped to be part of a kinder, more unified community. People planted trees together, organized block parties without fear of arbitrary fines, and welcomed those from all walks of life, including children with disabilities. The wetlands development that Karen had championed was canceled thanks to renewed environmental scrutiny. The area is now recognized as a protected habitat. It's a small victory for nature and a testament to how one stand for justice can ripple outward. Danielle's burns healed with minimal scarring. She resumed her physical therapy, determined to maintain her strength. While the memory of the assault still haunted her, she found ways to channel her experience into advocacy, speaking at local schools about bullying, discrimination, and the importance of standing up for those who are vulnerable. There's a sparkle in her eyes when she tells me about the kids who come up to her afterward, saying she's inspired them to be more empathetic. She's transforming her pain into a beacon of hope for others, and as her father, I couldn't be prouder. Meanwhile, I return to the regular chaos of the trauma ward, patching people up and saving lives as best I can. But I carry an added layer of conviction now that we must also treat the wounds in our own neighborhoods, the systemic injustices that hurt people just as surely as any physical injury. If it means stepping out of my comfort zone to shine a light on corruption, then so be it. My daughter's courage taught me that passivity in the face of evil is never an option. Sometimes I still see Karen's face in my mind, twisted with anger as she poured that boiling water. It's an image seared into my memory, an emblem of how cruel one person can be when blinded by prejudice and lust for control. Yet, ironically, it also became the catalyst for exposing a rotten system. Had she not committed such a brazen act, many of her other crimes might have remained buried longer. In a strange way, her atrocity galvanized the community into action, uniting neighbors who had once felt powerless and alone. I suppose that's the silver lining in this nightmare. Darkness, when confronted, can lead ordinary people to do extraordinary things. And for Danielle, it was a turning point, a moment when she realized her voice mattered, that she wasn't just a victim but a fighter for what's right. To those who ask me if I regret moving here, my answer is complicated. On one hand, it brought unimaginable pain and fear. On the other, it gave us a deeper purpose, a sense of mission to protect not just ourselves, but anyone threatened by someone like Karen. We remain in Millstone Court. Danielle refused to leave, saying if we go, she wins. And so we stayed, and in the process we helped a whole community reclaim its sense of belonging. Strangely enough, I have found more true neighbors than I ever would have expected, from Mr. Hamilton to Sarah Johnson, from Carla to Michael Ross. These people chose to stand up not out of grand heroism, but out of simple decency and empathy, virtues that Karen had tried so hard to squash. Life is never without challenges. The legal aftershocks continue to reverberate. Depositions and lawsuits and further investigations rumble on. Yet there's progress every day. Danielle is thriving, looking forward to high school. She's eager to meet new friends, to volunteer in local disability support groups, and to keep pushing for changes in community spaces so that children like her are never made to feel unwelcome. As for me, I'm content to keep juggling my roles. Father, surgeon, accidental activist. When I see Danielle smiling at that new accessible playground, her wheelchair rolling easily up the ramp that the HOA finally agreed to install, I feel a surge of gratitude. We turned the tragedy into a reason for growth, not just for ourselves, but for those around us. I share this story so people realize that sometimes the worst villains aren't always lurking in dark alleys. They can be found in bright, manicured neighborhoods, hidden behind formal titles and polite smiles, weaving networks of corruption that entangle innocence. And sometimes all it takes is one spark, one act of violence that reveals the vile underbelly to unify a community against the wrongdoing. My daughter's screams were the call to action. Our neighbor's resolve was the backbone that kept us fighting. And ultimately, justice prevailed, shedding light on injustices that might otherwise have remained in the shadows. I've witnessed horrors in the emergency room, but none have shaken me like watching my own daughter suffer at the hands of a HOA tyrant. Yet that same tragedy opened my eyes to the resilience of ordinary people. If there's a lesson in this, it's that change doesn't come from looking away. Sometimes we're called to confront it head-on, guided by the simple truth that no one, especially no child, deserves to live in fear or pain. With unwavering determination and a little luck, even the mightiest tyrants can be toppled. leaving behind a better world for everyone. And so, at Millstone Court, life now moves forward with new leadership and a renewed sense of purpose. We share potlucks and watch over each other's kids with genuine care. We laugh more freely and gather for block parties that celebrate our diversity rather than stifle it. Neighbors pitch in for repairs or babysitting, forging friendships that transcend mere proximity. The newly elected HOA president, a kind woman named Rebecca, introduced a simpler set of guidelines focused on safety and inclusivity, scrapping the labyrinth of punitive regulations Karen had inflicted on us. The day they officially renamed the playground Danielle Circle in recognition of her courage, I couldn't help letting tears slip down my cheeks. Seeing Danielle cut the ribbon with her bandaged arm, flanked by Jenny and Lucas, was a reminder of how far we'd come from that horrifying afternoon of boiling water and screams. We took something ugly and turned it into something beautiful. We exposed a nest of corruption and replaced it with accountability and hope. That doesn't erase the pain or the scars, but it shows that renewal is possible. It's the best any of us can hope for in a world often overshadowed by greed and malice. That by standing firm for what's right, we can create pockets of light for ourselves and those we love.